Hi, this is Scott. I really appreciate our sponsors because they make the show possible. Today's show is sponsored by Telerik. Create compelling app experiences across any screen with the Telerik platform. Telerik's end-to-end platform uniquely combines industry-leading UI tools with cloud services to simplify the entire app development cycle. Telerik offers everything .NET developers need to build quality apps faster. Try it free at telerik.com/platform. That's telerik.com/platform.
From HanselMinutes.com, it's Hansel Minutes, a weekly discussion with web developer and technologist Scott Hanselman. This is Lawrence Ryan announcing show number 525. In this episode, Scott talks with Nadia Eghbal about how open source software gets funded.
Hi, this is Scott Hanselman. This is another episode of Hansel Minutes. Today, we're talking about funding open source and how open source gets funded with Nadia Eghbal. How are you?
I'm good.
So you're an independent researcher, and right now you're founded by the Ford Foundation. How long have you been exploring how people and how projects get funding?
Long time, I guess, over the course of a lot of different jobs and career trajectories. This most recent exploration has been going on various forums since last summer, and I've really dived into open source specifically, I'd say, since the last fall or so.
Mm-hmm. But you've done business analysis, you've done product strategy, and you were yourself a co-founder. When you were co-founding your own company, did you go looking for money?
Yeah, we did. And we participated in an accelerator called 500 Startups.
Mm-hmm. Were you using open source as part of your company?
Definitely. I think that was my first introduction to it, was using all these different open source libraries and frameworks and languages to build our product, and just being like, wow, this is great. We can build a whole business using all these tools that are at our disposal. And from there, starting to wonder, how does all this stuff get supported, and where does it come from?
Was that challenging? I mean, I understand that sometimes people think of licensing as being challenging, but was it hard to put all of those Lego pieces together as a company?
I think it was actually pretty easy, because I wouldn't call myself a highly skilled developer. I was just sort of cobbling things along as we went. And so having a bunch of things that I could already use instead of having to figure it all out on my own, having to build less stuff on my own, just made it a lot easier to get up and going.
Mm-hmm. But what about, plugging things in technologically is different than plugging them in license-wise. Like, you might say this is a great piece of software and this is a great piece of software, but this one's GPL and we're not going to use that in our startup or whatever.
I don't think we even thought about licenses back then. And I think a lot of people, it's sort of like a thing I've noticed with a lot of developers now that I've talked to, is a lot of people aren't as concerned about licenses. Or aren't even really familiar with what all the different ones are. And they just think, well, if it's on GitHub, it must be open source, which is not true. But I think it sort of reflects the attitude that we have now in terms of using open source technology, where it's just, you see it as something that's free and available and you can kind of pick it up and use it. And so there's a little bit of a tension now, I think, between what licenses meant for open source and free software, back in the 80s and now it's sort of like the default, right?
But isn't that kind of a problem? I mean, we can't just slap stuff together. Like it's really kind of exciting / scary that you said that the folks that you talk to don't give that much thought.
Yeah. I mean, it's something like, I think 15% of GitHub repos have a license on them, which is not that much. And I know there are a lot of personal projects on GitHub, and, not everything needs a license either, I guess. But yeah, I think it reflects this attitude of, I'm going to default to giving something away and not think of it as a special circumstance. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess it's an interesting tension in that it's cool to see that culturally it's, we're seeing open source as the norm, right? But in the end, you still have the law and you still have to answer to somebody. And so you've seen, I think, like, GitHub is probably trying to figure out how to address that. And Stack Overflow right now, I don't know if you followed their license thing.
They use Creative Commons?
Yeah, they use Creative Commons, and they're trying to switch to, I think, an MIT license last I was following it. but trying to grapple with that because, code that's licensed under Creative Commons is sort of, I guess, just like not really used. It's sort of a weird license.
Yeah, Creative Commons doesn't really lend it. It thinks about prose, I think, more than...
Yeah, and there was sort of like requirements of attribution and things like that. But it's sort of funny, I guess, because they could have gone a really long time and not really thought about or addressed the license issue. And I think it's gotten to the point where so many people are using these things. It's like, how do we deal with this legally? What does it mean? And I think there was I haven't followed what happened with Stack Overflow recently, but I know that they were trying to figure out what happens to code that was under the Creative Commons license before. They can't retroactively apply a license. So do you have two different licenses on the site, and how do people know which is which? And it just gets very complicated quickly. No one really likes thinking about legal stuff, but it's, we're all kind of subject to the law, right?
Yeah. I think what happened was Stack Overflow decided that not public domain was an explicit thing. People were just assuming I found it, and that's okay. As I understand it, attribution is required when you use code at Stack Overflow. So if even if there's no clear license, if you go and use it, you copy paste it, you have to say, I got this from Stack Overflow, which that really right away changes people copy pasting code. And that went into effect on the 1st of March, as I recall.
Yeah, I think that's the last thing that I saw from it. And it's interesting to think about with companies and stuff. And companies are trying to mirror open source practices, even internally. And so if you're a developer and you're just used to using Stack Overflow in your own projects, and then suddenly it's well, at work, we can't do this. Or now, it's requiring attribution in company code is sort of weird. And how do you deal with all of that?
So people, if you look at the Stack Overflow question, people are going insane, and it's been downvoted to oblivion. And it seems totally reasonable though, attribution in all things. Even if I try to tweet something, if there's ever a room, I try to attribute.
Yeah, I think it's just I think that sort of highlights that awkward tension right now, right? Where from the developer's perspective, it's sort of code belongs to everybody, and why should we have to think about who to attribute things to or not? And then from the legal perspective, of course, it makes sense that Stack Overflow or anyone else in that position would, want to cover all their bases and everything. And so, it's just sort of a really weird time. And I think it's cool to look at because it's we're in this cultural inflection point, right? Where this stuff has to get sorted out somehow.
Yeah, totally. I think that they're probably covering their own butts too, because someone could conceivably, I'm just thinking about an overzealous lawyer, sue Stack Overflow because something bad happened, even though they're just the holder of the code. One thing I wanted to mention is that you talked about how 15% of GitHub repos or thereabouts have licenses.
Yeah.
There's a lovely website they put up called choosealicense.com, which is great. And
they did it, I think, partially in response to that study. I think it was SFLC that did that study that said it was 15% of repos have a license. And they did that in 2013, I think. And then it was sort of in response to that GitHub put up that microsite, and then they started offering, I think when you create a new repo now, they suggest a license and just try to be a little bit more encouraging to help people think it through. And it shouldn't be scary. There's only a couple of licenses that are really commonly used. And I think that site does a great job breaking down the pros and cons very easily.
Definitely. It's not exactly a flow chart, and certainly talk to a lawyer. But if you've got a bunch of little small samples that you wrote in a couple of hours or little minor things, license them.
Yeah, right.
So those things, those little pieces of code that may not necessarily be the essence of our software, but they might be the software around our software. You could call that open source infrastructure. And you wrote a wonderful post about that. Could you explain what open source infrastructure is? Yeah,
I think to preface that, we're still all trying to figure out what the right vocabulary is. And so I've ended up settling on the term open source infrastructure for now, but I think it's sort of this collaborative process where no one really knows what the final vocabulary will be. But I've tacked on the term infrastructure to distinguish from every other kind of open source project. Just to kind of point to the way I define it is projects that are being used to build other software. So the kind of all the components that you need to build software, like languages or frameworks or databases or libraries and things like that, which is different from, say, an consumer facing app that happens to also be open source. And so it's interesting because there are changes that are affecting everybody in open source where the definition of open source itself is changing. Like I think a lot of people are using the term open source to refer to anything that's open or anything that's published, whether it's you could open source a book or something, right? Mm-hmm. And that I think there's just sort of like a lot of confusion right now of what is open source, and maybe that's partially why licenses, the license question is getting sort of like pushed out a little bit, because people just think open source equals open.
Right. And there's still people who believe that, who not believe, but there's also the differentiation between OSS and, FLOSS, you know?
Totally. Yeah. And the term that you use really matters, right? So yeah, there's lots of different terms floating around. And so I'm particularly interested in infrastructure as a subset of open source, because I think right now people are maybe sort of like comfortable about open source in the sense of thinking, we like to see the best of open source, right? Like we like seeing that it's a volunteer-based effort and people are kind of like giving of their own accord. It's a place where creativity thrives. And it's sort of like this self-supporting, anarchic-looking system from the outside. And so there isn't a lot of motivation, I guess, to look deeper and say, well, is it really being well supported? It's worked really well for the past, 3-4 decades. But things are changing right now too, and there's so much more demand and pressure on infrastructure to support like everything else in software because open source is being used everywhere. And is that infrastructure? Is it reasonable to expect that infrastructure gets supported by volunteers, or has the time kind of come to start thinking about how we can support it a little bit more institutionally?
Yeah. You mentioned. Well, you were asking yourself the question, well, isn't open source fine? Like, surely there's no health problem in open source. It's well funded, right?
Yeah. And I think it's a nice image to think about if you're not super familiar with open source. It's just like, oh, I know it's this warm and fuzzy thing where people make stuff and they put it out there and we can use it. And you don't really think about or hear about the maintenance and the hard work that goes into it. There's, I think, a little bit more of like a user mindset now than a community contributor mindset and I felt this like as a new developer myself, where it's just like you're learning how to code and someone tells you to download this library or put it in your app and you're just like, great, I do this thing and now I can keep building what it was I was trying to build in the first place. And you don't always think about, well, there's a real human being on the other side of that project who is, trying to keep up with the demand. And sometimes it's just one person, sometimes it's 10 people, sometimes it's a whole community, but there's a lot going on under the hood.
I'm finding also that the long tail of open source is very long. And by that, I mean, there's a popular open source project that we want to use at Microsoft and we want people to use. And there were at its peak, 40 humans working on this thing. And it was very stable. And then now it's time to update it for the new stuff, and it turns out there's only one person left, and he's not really interested in working on it because he's got other things to do. Like, why is the person who created it 2 years ago the person who should be maintaining it today?
Totally.
And gosh, that's an anchor around that person's leg. And but at the same time, there's emotions. If we go and fork the thing,
right.
Then we've taken over their space. So like, for example, I've got a video game for babies. It's called Baby Smash, and it's for little kids. I made it for my son. Well, my son is 10 now. Do I just abandon it? Do I let it go? Do I let someone fork it? Well, I really like having ownership over it. All of these issues multiplied many times, especially when thinking about real software that makes real businesses run, is really overwhelming. I
think it's a fascinating tension that we're seeing now, and we're kind of in the age of the individual and the individual creator, where I think like people feel empowered to express themselves creatively, to build up their own brands. You have like YouTube creators, YouTube brands, whatever. And you're kind of like, you're an artist, right? And I think a lot of people associate open source work with that sense of artistry. And so there's a part of me that's, really wants to uphold that idea of, well, we should be supporting individuals and we should, if it's someone's project, if it's someone's baby, like, you can't mess with that. And then on the other hand, what's, I guess, awkward about open source infrastructure, or I guess a lot of open source projects that differs from, say, visual art, is people are using and relying on that stuff. It's not like you look at a painting and you appreciate it and you walk away, or you listen to a song and And, it's a recording. But if you're using that stuff in your software and you're trying to make sure things don't break, and somebody has to be maintaining that project. And then, it's awkward because it's personal, right? And if you're the author, maybe you feel ownership over the thing that you so lovingly created. And at the same time, open source is sort of rooted in this idea of community ownership, and there is no one person who owns a project, and you're kind of putting it out there, and people are helping you build, people are contributing and all this stuff. And so it's hard to reconcile, I think, that community ethos of open source with, especially I think for these like smaller and more medium-sized projects, the reality that there is like one or two people that are maintaining it.
That is a really interesting point. And I think it was Noah Kantrowitz from, and I found his post from your post. He spoke in Portland at Open Source Bridge about how there was a time when there was the commons, capital T, capital C, the commons. And this is, 50% put the work in and 50% reap the benefits.
Yep.
But now it's not in balance anymore. Lots of people are reaping the benefits and very few people are doing the work.
Totally. Yeah.
That can be really overwhelming. So then the obvious question is, why don't we just start charging money for open source?
Yeah, I mean, you could. I think there's going to be, if I had to guess, I think there's going to be some pushing of the boundaries in terms of what we've traditionally thought open source means, I guess. I think you've seen some people advocating for paid licenses or, default to paid, and then you pay for an open source license or whatever it is, which are all just sort of like interesting creative solutions. And it's hard, I think, because open source is rooted in free software, right? That's the movement that preceded it. And it's rooted in this feeling of like, we're trying to give things away for free. And I think that it's even a good thing, right? That software is made free and infrastructure is free so that we can kind of pick it up and use it in our own projects. And that's really cool because it's just a tool, right? And you can use that tool to experiment and build lots of really cool things. But there has to be some sort of way to reconcile what, a very, very large software company, for example, that can afford to give back and versus like a hobbyist developer who's using it for free. I don't know if charging it for it directly is going to be the answer to everything. I'm just sort of excited that a lot of people are experimenting with different models right now. I just think that there's going to be new support sustainability models that we haven't seen before that are going to be emerging right now. And like, who really knows what's going to win out, right? I'm sort of agnostic about it, but yeah.
One of my favorite quotes in one of your Medium posts, and I would encourage people to check you out on Medium, was you said, "By not charging for open source infrastructure, we protect the right of anybody with an internet connection to teach themselves how to code and build."
Yeah.
And I think that's really important. Like if there's a barrier to entry, even $5, that's enough to stop a non-zero percentage of people from making.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, you think about like all of these coding schools or tutorials even or whatever, and they're all using free resources to teach people. And that's really cool. Like I learned how to code for free because I could just download Ruby, right? And learn on my computer at home. And that's like, we kind of take that for granted that, if someone were to charge to use a language, which has happened in the past, right?
Sure.
That would completely change how many people would learn. And sort of like the boom that we're seeing right now with tech is partially because we gave people all these free tools and said like, go build stuff. So yeah, I mean, I think like really there's just going to be different solutions for all different sorts of projects and people in different situations. And I'm not opposed to that. I don't think that charging can solve all the problems, but maybe it can solve a couple people's problems.
Right. You point out that not charging is good not only for people who are learning, but also for startups. And Mark Suster, the VC, says that, there was a time when half of your money was for infrastructure and half of it was for coding and launching. And now basically infrastructure software is free. I launched my own little startup and I just literally an hour and a half ago did my taxes with my partner, Greg, and our total costs last year were about $2,000.
And
it was basically for the Azure cloud time. It was like 3 computers running in the cloud for a year in 3 different data centers across the world, et cetera, et cetera. A couple of $1,000s for a year. But I I realized we didn't pay for our development tools. We didn't pay for our runtime. We used a bunch of open source software. Here's the rub though. If something big broke in one of those open source pieces of software, would that be enough to destroy our little startup?
It could be. I think it has destroyed other people's startups. I just read one. Gosh, I can't remember what company it was. It was some sort of like photo sharing app where you take a picture and you like randomly send it to someone around the world or something like that. It's just like a fun app, right? But they had a whole bunch of people using it, and I was reading about it, and they said that the reason it shut down was because somebody was kind of like hacking into it to show them what the vulnerabilities were. And so there were like a bunch of vulnerabilities around it, and the people who developed it, I guess from my understanding, they just didn't have the technical expertise to understand how to address those vulnerabilities, because they were using probably just a bunch of open source software and cobbling things together. And if someone kind of points out these issues, you're like, I don't know, and they ended up shutting down the app because they were sort of like, well, we know there are all these like giant scary loopholes. We have no idea how to resolve them. So we're probably not the right people to do a photo app, which is kind of a shame. Right. I just went to a talk. I was at a conference last week, and someone was giving a talk about junior developers and security in particular. And I think like the story goes so beyond security or whatever, but I think it's an interesting point that so many people know how to code now that they don't need to have as deep of an understanding of everything they're doing because they're using other people's tools, right? And within each of those tools are tons of vulnerabilities or just like tons of things that could break and they don't understand how to fix them or whatever. And it's hard because like you're really reliant on other people's projects and expertise and infrastructure to make your own stuff work. And I think that might be one of the best arguments for why we need to come together in the tech industry and support open source infrastructure, because we're all relying on somebody else's work and you don't know who that person is. You don't know what their situation is. We've seen a whole bunch of other, security bugs and vulnerabilities found in other projects that we use. And that's kind of scary, right? Like it's scary that that's not in our control, and it's in everybody's best interest to help support that stuff and make it better.
I don't know if this analogy works, but I'm thinking about the relative levels of expertise that one might have in an industry and the relative levels of layers of abstraction that we sit on top of. I think about the fact that my ability driving a car stops at being able to change my own oil and maybe my tires.
Yeah.
Right. But my parents know how to take cars apart. Wow. So they would totally be into driving an open source car.
Wow.
So then the question is, would I be the right audience for an open source car? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's a perfect analogy or not. There is no perfect analogy, but how far down do you have to go? If you're a plumber, then you get to use open source plumbing tools. But should I be doing that to save money?
Right.
What is the motivator? I think a lot of people are using open source and copy pasting from Stack Overflow. Wouldn't you say? It's horrible to say this, but because they're lazy?
Or they just don't know any better. It's sort of magical, right? I mean, I can say this as a very junior developer. It's magical when you like create your own app for the first time and you see it online and you're like, wow, I just did that in 5 minutes. That's awesome.
Yeah.
And I think you have this feeling of, well, as long as it works enough and people can kind of see it and, that's good enough, right? I mean, you can raise money with no back end and just a really shiny looking front end.
And a text box that says, email me when you go live.
Like actually, right? Yeah. And so it's sort of like people are just saying, all right, it's good enough. And now I can go on with my idea and not really thinking about like all the stuff underneath. And I think it's
like Heartbleed.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I mean, Heartbleed is the best example of this. And I think it's unrealistic to expect that everyone is just going to like learn how to use your analogy, like, how to change their own oil or go under the hood of a car. And some people sort of like harken back to the good old days when developers understood all these things. And like, wouldn't it be nice if people understood all this stuff? And like, they're just not going to. But I would like to take the approach of at least like mitigating some of that risk by saying, all right, they might not do it. And yeah, maybe it's because they're lazy. It's because they're inexperienced or don't understand, whatever the case. But we should at least that makes a pretty good case for us making sure that infrastructure is well supported and that the people who are maintaining things have the resources they need.
Right. And just in case anyone's confused, or if you're confused, I'm not implying laziness on the part of people who are getting started or I am a lazy programmer, and I am also a lazy person who would very much like to get in a car and drive somewhere without having to learn how to be a mechanic.
Totally.
So it's okay to be lazy. It's not meant to denigrate anybody.
Yeah. I think it's a good mindset to start from, is like, just assume people are lazy, and it's not wrong. We're all just human, right? And so given that,
appropriate laziness.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, so what are you doing to change this? You are researching this, and you're working for you're being supported by the Ford Foundation right now?
That's right. I kind of started out, so I just sort of explored it for fun without really much of a plan in the fall. I just kind of had the time and the space and the funding to talk to a lot of different people and kind of like understand all these different perspectives. And I just started writing about it in January to see, just to like let people know what I was up to and see whether anybody else cared, because I wasn't sure if anyone else cared, and got a really good response to it, and realized that there's a great opportunity for, I think a lot of people don't know what's going on in the open source world. They're hearing the word open source a lot, but they don't actually know what it means. And everyone's sort of like nodding and smiling, but they don't actually understand anything that's going on, and they want to understand. So there's a great opportunity, I think, just to sort of like bring together different parts of different tech communities that maybe haven't been talking to each other before, to say like, hey, what are the risks involved, and how do we address them, and how do we help support people who are doing all this really great work that we all rely upon. The past couple of months have been sort of like raising awareness around that, and trying to get all the right people in the room. And from that, we've been sort of developing what are some specific types of things we could be doing. Because obviously, like, some people have called this like a funding problem. I don't think it's as simple as funding. It's a lot. If you can't just like hand people money and then, they spend the money, and then where's the sustainable model in that, right? Mm-hmm. And so it becomes this much more complicated question of like, how do you support things without funding them directly, or when is it appropriate to fund things directly, and how can you help each of those projects find sustainability? And those are kind of like any like nonprofit problem or any like philanthropy problem struggles with that, right? Where it's like, ideally, you're not just like giving a grant, but you're trying to figure out how to help them help themselves.
Throwing money at this is not the way.
Right. And I think that's kind of actually been part of the problem when people talk about funding open source is people are trying to sort of like say, well, can't we just like raise a whole bunch of money and donate it to the projects? But some projects don't need money, right? Like every project is really, really different. So you can't just like automate that. It is really just all about people. And some projects, even if they had money, maybe it's not enough money, or they wouldn't know what to do with the money. So I think the problem goes much deeper than that. We've been talking through like, what are some specific, programs and initiatives that we could at least try to see how we can positively support open source. And so I've been talking to a bunch of different people about that, and hopefully developing something that can kind of start to move forward with beyond the research and the writing phase.
There's a great quote from Yehuda Katz, who says, as a tech community, we should treat documentation and marketing and logistics and infrastructure with as much respect as we do engineering.
Yes, absolutely. And I think therein kind of lies part of the problem, because open source naturally draws people who love to code, right? And so you have a lot of developer talent. But I don't think anything can fully sustain itself on pure code. Like no organization or sector or industry can purely run on engineers. Even if it's just a little bit, you need somebody who is thinking sort of about like sustainability or fundraising or community or whatever it is. And so what I've been thinking about is sort of like, what are all those other pieces that we need to fill in to help take the load off of maintainers, or just make it easier for them to advocate for themselves and, find sponsors or whatever it is. I think like one area is that a lot of maintainers would love to be sponsored by companies, but companies aren't aware of which projects need help. And they don't really know how to talk to each other. So like a maintainer might be like, they might say, hey, company, like, why don't you, pay me X amount of money? And the company's sort of like, is this an invoice? Is this a marketing thing? Is this a donation? Like, we don't really understand how to give to you. And so it's like, and one thing I've thought about is, how can you develop better contracts and support documents to just make that automated and easy? And you see some parallels in the startup venture world too. So for example, this form of investing called using convertible notes became popular in recent years among startups, where it's just sort of like, it's just a much like faster way to get investment and get money. And as convertible notes became a popular way of investing, Y Combinator, which is a startup accelerator, developed these documents called the SAFE documents. And they use those as sort of like a standard agreement to make startups feel safe and investors feel safe, that they're using this like standard approved document to negotiate an investment into a company, right? And so basically it's just sort of like, there's a whole bunch of like legal confusion about, how do you structure a convertible note and whatever. And so Y Combinator kind of stepped in and said, hey, here's a document that everybody can use that we developed and, with a bunch of companies and investors and got a lot of input on, and everyone feels safe using that, right? So yeah, could you develop something like that for companies and maintainers to talk to each other and just make it easier on them?
And you put together a website called fundingoss.com. That's kind of a database of who's being funded, who's not, what they need.
Yeah, I actually have to give credit to Jay Gebauer for that. I actually just started as a spreadsheet because I'd already been collecting a bunch of projects on my own, and I was like, I'm sure I'm missing a lot because I just sort of discovered all those projects by talking to people one-on-one. And yeah, I put out like this spreadsheet, and then spreadsheets started getting kind of out of hand, which I guess is a good problem to have. And I woke up one morning and Jay had created this website and was like, here you go. Just made a simple web app to help you manage submissions, which was awesome. Magic, open source. So yeah, and it's been, it's sort of just, it's really just meant to be a place to share projects and needs. And I've actually been using it to reference when I talk to the people who say, do you know a project that fits XYZ bill or whatever? I've gone through that list and found stuff. So yeah, if you have a project that needs support, whether it's money or just like maintainers or contributions or whatever, it's a great place to put it.
Yeah, we're starting to see lots of places like that. So you've got fundingoss.com. People should check out. There's also upforgrabs.net, which is up for grabs with hyphens in between. That's got a couple of hundred of websites. And these are places looking for pull requests and documentation. And also a reminder to folks that, again, it's not just for engineers. You could be doing documentation. Yes. You could be doing tests. Take a look at first timers only. We're trying to put together a list of open source projects that are friendly to people who are doing open source for the first time.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. You should check out Your First PR as well.
Yes. We've actually, Your First PR is great, and we've been working with them with first timers only and promoting them on Twitter as well.
Awesome.
Very cool. Well, thanks so much, Nadia, for talking with me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
This has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and we'll see you again next week.